Thank you so much, Linda and the choir, for the beautiful music. Thank you. So our worship theme for the month has been humility. And as we often do in December, we've been looking at the theme through the lens of different world religions. And I really should say we've been inspired by different world religions, because it is always a Unitarian Universalist lens that we look through, but we draw inspiration from many different traditions. So in the first 2 weeks, we drew on stories from Judaism and Buddhism, and today we are going to be looking at the Christian tradition, and specifically some of the teachings of Jesus about humility and power, and how they relate to something that he called the kingdom of heaven. Now, there aren't many sources of information about the life and teachings of Jesus outside of the writings of the early Christian community itself. Jesus was an obscure man in an obscure part of the world whose short life came to a violent end in a way not all that uncommon for his time and place. Executed as just one more rabble-rousing Jew by an occupying Roman government that was determined to maintain law and order at all costs. We know about him primarily because a small community of believers and evangelists continued to spread his teachings and his stories of his life throughout the Mediterranean. Eventually, those stories and sayings were gathered up and shaped into the 4 books of the New Testament that are called the Gospels. The earliest Gospel, the Gospel of Mark, was written around 30 or 40 years after Jesus' death. The last Gospel, the Gospel of John, maybe 50 years after that. And although they claim to be based on eyewitness accounts, which is a claim that many scholars find highly questionable, the Gospels are not histories, and they are not intended to be histories. Their purpose is to tell the meaning of Jesus' life, not the facts of Jesus' life, each in a different way and for a different intended audience. What we can say about Jesus is what he inspired in that community that gathered around him and gathered after his death. Jesus first attracted attention as a healer and a prophet, but after his death, a widening circle of people became convinced that in the person of Jesus there was evidence that God was working in the world in a new way. In a new way. They believed that through Jesus, something new was happening. And what they believed that he demonstrated to them was that the kingdom of God on earth was imminent. That is, that heaven itself was about to break through into this world and transform it. It is important to remember that early Christianity was an apocalyptic religion. They believed that Jesus had an apocalyptic message. The kingdom of heaven is coming now. Any day now. Really soon. And Jesus said to his disciples, as reported in the gospel, he said to them, "Before this generation of people that I am talking to now passes away, I say to you, the kingdom of heaven will be at hand." And in the context of this belief, the radicalism of that early Christian communities makes a lot of sense, because they believed that a realm of radically different values was about to break into the world, and they were trying to get ahead of the curve and create communities that reflected those radically different values that we would soon all be living in. Any day now, the kingdom of heaven was going to come, and then it didn't. And then it still didn't, and they were left to figure out, what does this mean now? What do we do with this? Now, Jesus in his teachings, as portrayed in the Gospels, spends a lot of time talking about this coming kingdom of heaven, this new order that is going to enter the world. What is heaven like? He is constantly trying to explain it using all of these different approaches and different metaphors. He says the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, the tiniest of seeds, so small you can barely see it. But when you plant it, it grows a plant so large that the birds come and nest in its branches. He defines the kingdom of heaven by who we will find there: the poor, the meek, the persecuted, the humble, the humble. He explains heaven by how you get there, by selling all of your possessions and giving them to the poor, by becoming a servant of all, by loving your neighbor as yourself, by becoming as a little child. And in the gospel stories, he tries time and again to explain what this new coming kingdom of heaven on earth, what this new transformed world will look like. And time again, his very disciples, the people closest to him, fail to understand. So there's a story that appears almost identically in 3 of the 4 Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where Jesus has just returned from another hard day's work, like healing and prophesying, all around the countryside. And he notices that his disciples have gathered close together in a circle, and they're arguing with each other. So he asks them, what's all this about? And his disciples say, we're trying to decide which one of us 12 is going to be greatest in this kingdom of heaven. So they've been following their teacher, Jesus, all around the countryside, and they've been listening to him preach. And they've been listening to all of his talk about the kingdom of heaven. And what they want to know of us is which of us is going to be at the top of the org chart in heaven. Which disciple gets the corner office? Who gets the company car and the platinum Visa card? This is what they want to know. And they're asking this in the context of the society that they lived in. The ancient world, the Roman world, which was explicitly organized around starkly defined hierarchies of power and status. In the ancient world, power and status was everything. Everything. Power and status determined your life and your station in life. And ancient society was characterized by dominance in a wide variety of relationships. Master over slave, patron over client, husband over wife, father over family, and ruler over subject. So dominance was the natural category by which people thought about things. Who will I rule over, and who will rule over me in this coming kingdom? Ancient society was characterized by great inequalities of wealth and power, in which a tiny elite controlled most of everything. And so scarcity and competition for resources shaped people's values and their decision-making. What will I have? What can I get and keep for myself? What can I get for my family? And in ancient society, one's personal and family reputation in the public eye was the standard of value. So fame and status were greatly to be desired. Fame and status was how you knew that you were doing it right. Fame and status was validation. Does any of this sound familiar? So the disciples want to know, in this kingdom of heaven that you're always going on about, the one that's going to come like any day now, which of us is going to be the greatest? And Jesus tells them, you have this completely wrong. Wrong, like your values are totally backwards. You don't understand what this greatness is of which you speak. And he calls a small child over to sit in his lap, and he says, whoever becomes humble like this child will be greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And there are a number of places in the gospel where Jesus commends becoming childlike. And he is very concerned with the loving treatment of children. And he says specifically multiple times that the kingdom of heaven belongs to children, and to get there you have to become like a child. And it's important to understand this in context. Because as modern people, our ideas about children have been shaped by the sort of Victorian cult of childhood and all of the sentimentality about children that it inspired, right? So we think about Tiny Tim, we think about Little Women, we think about Zuzu's Petals, right? And like a billion Hallmark moments and holiday specials and Miracle on 34th Street. So when Jesus says that we must become as a child to enter the kingdom of heaven, that may make intuitive sense to us because we're thinking of children as angelic, as innocent, as pure, as close to God, right? That is a very modern way to think about children. In the ancient world, that is not what being childlike would have called to mind for Jesus' audience. What would have been relevant about children in the ancient context is that children have no power. None. You want to talk about a society dominated by status and power? Children are the lowest of the low. right? Who rules over children? Everyone. Everyone. Even slaves can tell children what to do. They have no status, no reputation, no property, no bank. As my student Bible points out helpfully, whenever children appear in the gospel, they are portrayed as endangered, hungry, sick, demon-possessed, and dead. So when the disciples ask about greatness, and Jesus tells them to become like children, this is as radical a rejection of the values of the ancient world as could possibly be imagined. He is saying to them, everything you think is important, everything you hang your life on, power, money, status, reputation, security, these things are not to be found in the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is not founded on any of these things. And what is it founded on according to Jesus? Only love. Only love. So scribe asked Jesus, which of the commandments is the most important? And Jesus responds, love God with all of your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. And the scribe responds that such love is more important than all of the burnt offerings and sacrifices that there are, meaning all of the rituals and rules of organized religion. And Jesus says, you are not far from the kingdom of heaven. When love is at the center of our lives, then according to Jesus, we are not far from the kingdom of heaven. And let's stay with this idea for a minute. And I want to state the obvious, which is that we are using language today from a Christian context, which is not the context of everyone in this room. Not necessarily. It wasn't Jesus' context either, because Jesus was not a Christian. Right? He was Jewish. And I know for some that the word heaven is a loaded word, right? A lot of people have been beaten up, religiously speaking, with promises of heaven and hell, or with narrow ideas about who gets to go to heaven. So this word heaven is very loaded. Now our Universalist ancestors said everyone enters the kingdom of heaven, which is a way of saying that no one is excluded from or unworthy of love. And then later, they said, heaven is not some ethereal realm, right? Off in the stars somewhere where we all go when we die. Heaven is what happens on earth when we choose to center our lives in love rather than power, status, dominance, and security. And in this interpretation, which is a Unitarian Universalist lens, the kingdom of heaven is indeed breaking forth into the world all the time, just as Jesus said that it would. It is indeed transforming this world all the time, but it enters the world through us when we choose to center our lives in love. And it transforms the world through us when we act from love. But to do that, Jesus says, to really do that, you have to be like a child, which means you have to be willing to risk greatly. Because to be a child in the way Jesus means is not to be innocent, not to be angelic, but above all else, to be vulnerable. To be vulnerable. So in this context, I want to offer you today the story of a life centered in love and vulnerability. The true story of a woman named Ruth Corker Burks, who lived and lives in Arkansas. And this story is mostly taken from a June 2017 article in Out magazine by David Kuhn, and also from some interviews of hers. So in 1984, Ruth Corker Burks was 25 years old. She was a young mother living in Arkansas. She would eventually make her living as a real estate agent. And at this time, Ruth had a friend who was going through cancer. Right, so this friend was in the hospital all the time for treatments, and Ruth was visiting, so Ruth was in the hospital all the time. And one day she saw a hospital door that had this red bag that had been tied around it. And she noticed that the nurses in attendance were drawing straws to see which of them was going to go through that door. And Ruth suspected that the patient in the room had what at the time was called GRID, which stood for gay-related immune deficiency. Ruth had a gay cousin in Hawaii, and when she had heard that there were gay people getting ill on the West Coast, she had started educating herself about it because she was worried about her cousin. So she knew what this grid was doing to people, and she knew that the fear and isolation that people who had it lived in. And she saw the nurses drawing straws to see who was going to have to go through that door. So when no one was looking, Ruth went through that door, despite warning signs telling people not to go in. She ignored them and she went in. And inside she found a very sick young man who had wasted away to almost nothing. He was clearly dying. And Ruth talked to him and he told her that he just wanted to see his mom again before he died. So Ruth went back out to the nurses and she said he wants to see his mother. And the nurses laughed and said, "Honey, he's been here 6 weeks. There's nobody coming." So Ruth persisted. She got the number of the mother from the patient and she called the mother. The mother hung up on her. She called the mother back and she threatened, "I'm going to put his cause of death in the obituary." So the mother agreed to talk to her. She said, "He just wants to see you before he dies." And the mother said, "He is already dead to me." And she refused to see him. So Koons writes that Burke hung up the phone trying to decide what she would tell the dying man. She went back to his room, she said, and when I walked in, he said, "Mama, I knew you'd come." And he lifted his hand. So she took his hand and she said, "I'm here, honey, I'm here." She pulled a chair by his bedside and held his hand, bathed his face with a cloth, and stayed with him for 13 hours while he took his last breaths on earth. Now, the man's mother made good on her refusal to claim the young man's body, and so now Ruth had another decision to make. As it happened, she owned an entire cemetery, over 250 plots. And the reason that she owned this cemetery was because her mother had had a falling out with an uncle. So she had bought every plot in the cemetery because there was no way that so-and-so was going to be buried anywhere near her. And Ruth had inherited the plots, right? So since no one would claim this deceased young man's body, she claimed it herself. And paying the expense out of her own pocket, she buried his ashes in her family cemetery right next to her father. Now, somehow word got out that Ruth was someone who was not afraid to help people who had GRID, what we now call AIDS. And AIDS patients in the state of Arkansas began reaching out to her. And Koons writes, "They just started coming," Ruth said. "Word got out that there was this kind of wacko woman in Hot Springs who wasn't afraid. And they would tell them, just go to her. Don't come to me. Here's the name and number. Go to her." I was their hospice, Ruth says. Their gay friends were their hospice. Their companions were their hospice. Before long, Koons continues, she was getting referrals from rural hospitals all over the state. Financing her work through donations and sometimes out of her own pocket, she'd take patients to their appointments. She'd help them get assistance when they couldn't work. She'd help them get their medicines and try to cheer them up when their depression became as dark as a pit. She said many pharmacies wouldn't handle prescriptions for AIDS drugs like AZT, so she soon stockpiled what she called an underground pharmacy in her house that she made available to people. And of course, I should add that gay people were not helpless victims while this was going on, right? Nationally, gay men organized into ACT UP and other groups, and they radically altered the politics of AIDS health care. Locally, people cared for their partners with great love and loyalty and commitment amidst the total hostility, rejection, and ultimately indifference of the larger community, which did not care if they lived or died. And the gay community rallied around its own. Burke said the financial help given to patients for burial expenses, for medication, for rent, couldn't have happened without the support of the gay clubs around the state. She said they would twirl up a drag show on Saturday night and here'd come the money. That's how we'd buy the medicine, that's how we'd pay rent. If it hadn't been for the drag queens, I don't know what we would have done. And so there was Ruth doing what she could, because so few others would. Between 1984 and the mid-1990s, Ruth cared for and companioned hundreds and hundreds of gay men who were dying of AIDS in Arkansas. She buried over 36 men in her family's cemeteries, always after their own family refused to do the right and loving thing. She got used to being cursed at and prayed over by family members on the other side of that phone. She and her daughter were ostracized outside of the gay community in Arkansas. She says a cross was burnt on her lawn not once, but twice. But Ruth says that while she got to see the worst of people, she was also privileged to see people at their best, caring for their partners and friends with selflessness, dignity, and grace. And Kunz finishes the story with this. Before she's gone, Ruth said she'd like to see a memorial erected in the cemetery. Someday, she said, I'd love to get a monument that says, this is what happened. In 1984, it started. They just kept coming and coming, and they knew they would be remembered, loved, and taken care of, and that someone would say a kind word over them when they died. And that is just what Ruth Burks did. Ruth Burks chose to take up residence, if only for a while, in the kingdom of heaven that Jesus taught about. Her choices made little sense by the mainstream values of the society that she lived in, a society determined to turn its back on its gay members who had long been forced to live as the least among them. In the place of security, she chose to join with the most vulnerable and live with them in that place of vulnerability. In the place of power, she chose to take the side of the least powerful and wed her whole heart to their well-being, knowing that her heart was going to be broken hundreds and hundreds of times. And in the place of status, she chose ostracism. She chose to be famous like the buttonhole in the Naomi Shihab Nye poem, not because she did anything spectacular, but because she never forgot what she could do. Her decisions made no sense in this world. They only made sense in a different world, a world that Ruth chose to make real through a life centered in love. May we be inspired by her example to understand that there is a new love waiting to break through into the world, that a world with a different set of values is possible, and that the kingdom of heaven doesn't have to be out there somewhere. It can be right here among us, transforming our lives if we will only transform our hearts. Blessed be, and amen.